Welcome to The Keep, the Employee Experience Podcast. Your host, Greg Weiss, brings together experts from around the world sharing their insights on creating amazing employee experiences. Having the wrong attitude about their people can cost businesses a fortune. Having the right attitude will build success. Over to you, Greg.
Thanks, Angela. What does the Me Too movement mean to business today? And what impact does it have on the employee experience? In this episode of The Keep, we discuss how employers need to create a culture that no longer tolerates powerful people behaving badly. Today in the studio, I have Michael Burns. Michael is a partner with Schwab, and his area of practice is in employment law. So welcome to the studio.
Thanks, Greg. Thanks for having me.
We're in an interesting time. I'm curious for us to talk about the importance of a post-Harvey Weinstein, Kevin Spacey era. What's all this about?
Well, there's been a paradigm shift, Greg. What that means is that no matter how powerful you are, no matter what your status, no matter who you are, if you engage in conduct that is unacceptable, sexual harassment, bullying, conduct of that kind, then you will be held to account. That's the big difference post-Weinstein. And so in the past, what might have happened was this person is too powerful. This person needs to be protected. They bring in too much money. They're too exalted in their status. If you make a complaint, you're the one who is going to suffer by reason of making that complaint. What's happened to Harvey Weinstein and a whole range of others in the wake of the Weinstein scandal, and Kevin Spacey's an example, Matt Lauer's an example, Leslie Moonves, the former chief executive of CBS, is a prime business example. What has happened is that those people who previously might have been thought of as being untouchable are being held to account by reason of their conduct and their behaviour. And that's emboldening those people who have been subject to conduct of that kind to come forward, to make complaints, to raise these issues. And businesses, organisations are then taking these matters more seriously and treating them in a different way than they might have done in the past.
Okay.
It's a major change.
Okay, it's a huge change. So I'm speaking here with a partner in law, and we're going to be very curious to hear how many amazing words I'm going to be hearing from an educated and specialist lawyer. Emboldening was one of them. Is that the word I got?
Yes. I hope it's not a malapropism. I hope it's not someone's getting their dictionary now and realising it's not actually the right word.
Okay, which is...
But they're emboldened, Greg.
They are emboldened.
Yeah,
and getting serious again.
Yeah.
We're talking about the power of people in the past that was protected because of their position. And now the post-Harvey Weinstein, this Me Too era is about levelling the playing field.
You know the notion of protected species, the idea that someone's in such a position that they're untouchable.
Yes.
That has changed.
Right.
And there are now so many examples of that in Hollywood, in the broader business community, and I think that there is now a change in mentality, a change in
This
paradigm.
is almost, it's revolutionary, isn't it?
I think it is.
It's almost like a revolution where we've
Yes.
had the people who were protected in the past, say in the French Revolution or the Russian Revolution, etc. Those people in power were brought down, and this is a very, very similar thing, but this is a worldwide movement as well as legislated changes.
It is, and what it's about, though, of course, is people not so much being brought down in a way, but rather coming undone by virtue of their own behaviour.
Right.
Because we think about someone's career being, you think about Kevin Spacey's career being ruined or Kevin Spacey's career coming to an end, but actually that's not because people came forward about Kevin Spacey's conduct. It was because he engaged
Yes.
in that conduct in the first place.
Yes. Although
he
it
ruined
was-
his own career. Harvey Weinstein ruined his own career.
Yeah.
But of course the catalyst, what precipitated that, was this Me Too movement that emboldens, for want of a better word perhaps, people to come forward, raise these issues. And not only that, but do so with the knowledge that their voices will be heard, their complaints will be taken seriously, and that no one person is bigger than the organisation or the company.
So this is a really huge movement. And so So the question is, Michael, then around what does it mean to business today?
What it means to business today is that businesses need to take these issues very seriously. When an issue of sexual harassment or a complaint, allegation of sexual harassment or bullying is raised, then they really need to, not just to sweep it under the carpet, not just to say, well, the person against whom that complaint or allegation was made, they're too important, they generate too much money, they're untouchable, they're protected species, as might have occurred in the past, indeed the recent past. They need to take that complaint or allegation, properly investigate it, deal with it and address it. Because if they don't, they run the risk that at some point in the future, maybe in the near future, someone will get on social media, get out to the mainstream media, but social media is very easy to do this, and say, I raised this complaint against the CEO or managing director or senior executive of Company X. What did Company X do? Company X did nothing. And that is a real problem for organisations.
Huge problem.
Yes.
And it's so easy for anybody nowadays to become their own channel or to write.
Absolutely.
And be able to ride the platforms of Facebooks or otherwise. It's very hard, as a lawyer, it's very hard for forensic tracking, isn't it, of where did this thing start from? So somebody accuses an organisation of something. They can do this reasonably anonymously now, can't they?
They can. But the response, I think, Greg, is not to think, well, how dare this person accuse us or make this allegation against our company? How dare they? And I mean, it may well be in certain circumstances, of course, that is the response.
That might be the initial response.
Well, it might be the initial response, but actually there's a deeper question, which is, well, have we actually, did we receive this complaint or allegation? And if we did nothing about it, why did we do nothing about it? Why are we now not in a position to properly respond to this allegation or to this complaint or to this issue? And to me, the answer lies in taking these matters seriously and properly investigating them. Forms the basis for a response, both a legal response, but also a reputational media response. Because think about two different scenarios. One scenario, an allegation is raised, let's say on Facebook or Twitter. Someone posts a very long list of allegations against a senior executive of an organisation, and at the end they say, I raised this with the organisation, and the organisation did nothing about it. That's scenario one. Well, that makes the organisation look like they've swept it under the carpet. They're not interested at all. But what about scenario two, where the organisation is able to say, actually, we did investigate that matter.
Right.
We did take that complaint or allegation seriously, and we investigated, and there were findings of fact, and we acted on those findings of fact. Now, it may well be that the investigation found that there was no substance to the allegations or complaints, but at least the organisation is able to say, we took it seriously, we investigated it, and then you'd think most people would say, well, that's fair enough. If the complaints or allegations were made and then the company investigated them, at least the company took it seriously.
Right.
And addressed it, as opposed to doing nothing.
Yeah.
This is about a number of things. It's about the legal issues, legal liability. It's about the culture of the organisation. Having a culture of an organisation which does not countenance, does not accept bullying or harassment or inappropriate conduct directed towards its employees. And of course, what is also very important is the reputational element. You can't have an organisation headed up by a sexual harasser or by a serial bully. Well, you can, but of course that's detrimental to the reputation of that organisation.
And today, reputation is so much more easy to impact. We've seen this happen where, who would have thought really that Kevin Spacey, such an iconic figure within Hollywood, within weeks would have been torn down and never to be able to appear ever again, to the point where he was cast out of a movie.
That's right.
At whatever expense it was.
Actually edited out. I know, extraordinary, isn't it?
Extraordinary, it really is extraordinary.
Yeah.
Who would have thought that? And so to the point about reputation, it's very easy also for anybody to look up on things like Seek or Glassdoor, what the reputation of an organisation is.
Yes.
So in today's business environment, we're really looking at what you're saying is this Me Too movement could be seen potentially by some, maybe cynically, as this is a heck of an imposition. But the important thing is around the employee experience. And what is it that we're reflecting culturally, you're saying?
That's right.
Our values. And long haul, what does that mean to our reputation?
That's exactly right, Greg. It's about ensuring that employees are able to come to work in the knowledge that there's a safe, supportive work environment, and they're not going to be subject to these behaviours. And if they are, that will be considered to be unacceptable.
Right.
And that something will be done about it. And it's important for employees to have that knowledge, to have that comfort.
Yes, and so the protected species is really no longer.
Kevin Spacey is a prime example. A couple of years ago, you would have really wanted Kevin Spacey in your movie. He was pretty much a universally revered actor. Now he's a universally reviled actor and reviled person, and rightly so, to the point where he's edited out of movies.
Amazing.
So think about that in terms of business executives, in terms of top salespeople, top talent. In the past, you'd say, well, they're just too valuable to lose. They're too important. They're too good at what they do. Now, with this post-Weinstein paradigm shift, there's a view that actually we can no longer afford to have them in the organisation because of the damage they're doing to the brand, the integrity, the reputation of this organisation, and our employees won't countenance it, they won't cop it, and the general public, our consumers, our customers, they also will judge us negatively by keeping someone like this in place.
Absolutely. Now, before we go to the break, very, very clear that what we're talking about is a significant shift, a seismic shift really in terms of the way in which business needs to think about how they move forward. In the past, the individual is protected, the protected species of the winner, the sales guy, the CEO. Today, brand is much more important and brand reputation is much more important, and that's what's protected rather than the individual.
Agree with that, Greg. That's exactly right.
Let's go to the break.
Eagle Ways Radio, the voice of small business.
People come and go in organisations all the time, and while that's normal, high employee turnover can be expensive. Greg Weiss and Career Support 365 have structured onboarding and offboarding services. They create the foundation for long-term success, protecting the employer and brand while helping people perform at their best and fit in quickly. Start strong, finish strong. To find out more, go to careersupport365.com.
So welcome back to the Keep podcast, and I'm here again with Michael Burns, partner at Swab. Michael, we were talking about this seismic shift.
Yes.
So let's move on to culture, because it's something you talked about before the break, the role of culture in helping to sustain an open culture. Let's talk about that.
It's really important you have this culture that facilitates people coming forward with these sorts of issues, so they're not cowering in fear about coming forward when they're subject to inappropriate conduct. So that they're subject to sexual harassment or bullying, they feel they can come forward. And culture, the culture you have in the organisation, is important to achieving that.
Culture has often been established for quite some time. It takes a big shift to move from where the power, say, used to be to a much more even playing field, say, something where everybody's empowered and otherwise. So have you an example, say, of where an organisation has overtly changed its culture in order to be able to facilitate people coming forward?
A way that's often done is to implement training in relation to sexual harassment and bullying,
Right.
to introduce policies, or indeed to emphasise the policies that are already there, to send a message to your workforce, not just a token message, but a genuine message which is backed up by action, that these sorts of behaviours are unacceptable, and if you've been subject to them, to come forward. So it's about training, it's about policies, it's about communication of those policies, and then when it happens, if there is an allegation or complaint that is made, it's about walking the talk. It's about actually then going through with it and properly investigating these matters and living up to the promise or the aspiration that is stated in those policies. That's very, very important. The idea of just having paper policies or paper systems, which are spoken of in pejorative terms by courts and tribunals, that just, they look good. If you did an audit or a review, The idea of that, it's just not enough.
No, pejorative means what?
Pejorative means negative.
Right.
So courts speak of those things in a negative way. And so you actually have to implement those policies and make sure that what happens, the action steps are consistent, entirely consistent with those policies. No good having a policy saying come forward if you've been sexually harassed, come forward if you've been bullied, when a person does come forward and they're just ignored.
Let's take an example that not everybody is going to be employed by a large organisation. Let's just say, for example, that the perpetrator, so to speak,
Yes.
of this happens to be the person who's at the peak, say within a private organisation. So the owner of a business is in fact sexually harassing somebody, and that person wants to come forward. How do they do that? And this is not an isolated case.
No, it isn't. And that's tricky, obviously, for a range of
Yeah.
reasons, a tricky
Yeah.
situation.
Yeah.
So ideally, there'll be someone in that workplace to whom that person can come forward with the complaint.
Right. So who would that person be? Typically, say in any organisation, what would you recommend for an organisation to do to set those?
It depends how big the organisation is, of
Right.
course. So if there's an HR manager, it's very often the HR person.
Right. One's a bit smaller.
If it's smaller than that, it's the person in charge of operations or in charge of usually there's no hard and fast rule about this, but it's usually the person who might be the finance person. What is important, Greg, is that there is someone nominated to whom you can go.
Right.
That the policy is quite relatively prescriptive about or clear in setting out the person to whom you go or the contact officer.
Right.
So that if something does happen to you, there is someone to whom you go and perhaps an alternative
Right.
to that person.
And could that be best practice would be male, female, so that there'd be two people in an organisation?
Not necessarily, but that sometimes is done.
Right.
And some of these issues, of course, do involve a degree of sensitivity. What is not good enough is appointing someone as the contact officer or contact person under the policy, and then when you go to them with the allegation or with the complaint, they then go, I don't know what to do, actually. No one's ever told me what I'm meant to do. I don't really know how to handle this. They really need to be prepared and ready to go if an allegation is made and ready to then institute the process set out in the policy or institute a process, a structured process, in order to deal with this matter.
So what I've got at this particular point in time, that training is reinforced.
Yes.
And then that training is also given to new employees so they understand what the culture is and what the expectations
that's
and
very
the policies and
important.
procedures.
That induction onboarding process is very important.
Absolutely. Okay. And then it's not just a piece of paper that's tucked away in the drawer, but this thing lives and breathes, and that's what culture is.
That's exactly right. That document needs to inform the culture. The culture needs to align with the document. As you say, if the document either literally or metaphorically just is in the cupboard, not used, not referred to, and the culture is at odds with what is stated in the document, then the document is useless.
So I'm curious because often what I've seen, and we've all seen organisations with different cultures and values up on the wall. I'm wondering over time what we're going to be doing is we're seeing organisations that will have a much more overt lack of tolerance of bullying, harassment, or any of these behaviours that underpin the Me Too movement. So that what we're doing is we're adding to the values or finessing what those particular values mean.
That's right. I think there is very much a lower tolerance for behaviour of that kind, or a zero tolerance for behaviour that is genuinely of that kind. I mean, sometimes, just to look at the other side of things, there are sometimes issues raised that are asserted to be bullying or asserted to be sexual harassment, and objectively speaking, applying the legal principles, they're not.
Right.
They're not.
Such as?
Well, for instance, a prime example is this. Every employer has to have at some stage, or every employee at some stage is subject to a robust discussion with their employer. And it might be, for instance, because their performance in a particular aspect of their job is not quite up to standard. Sometimes it's an unpleasant conversation. We all would rather be praised all the time and receive compliments than any form of criticism. So that might be an unpleasant conversation. But if it is reasonable performance management conducted in a reasonable manner, then that's not bullying. And sometimes employees conflate a conversation that might be for them a little bit unpleasant, They might go home that day not feeling too good about the conversation that's been had and think, well, I've been bullied today because my boss said I need to sell more widgets or I need to do X, Y, Z in terms of the performance of my job. Actually, it may well be that it's reasonable performance management conducted in a reasonable manner, which can sometimes be unpleasant. It can sometimes be robust. We've all been subject to criticism at various... I'm sure you haven't, Greg, but most us mere mortals, we're subject to criticism from time to time from various quarters. That of itself, it might be unpleasant, but it's not necessarily bullying. And that's a prime example, actually, because sometimes employees do confuse performance management, genuine, reasonable performance management with bullying.
No, it's a very good point. And for the listeners out there around running a business normally and what they'd be expecting, they need performance to be done, but then there are some inappropriate areas that might underpin that. So there are some things that in the past would have been tolerated inherently, but no longer can be. So just on that, some of those behaviours, so that we can really nail this, okay? And I'm still going back to think that I didn't point you out about the word conflate. I love having a conversation with a lawyer.
I hope, Greg, people aren't looking up dictionaries and finding I'm completely misusing all of these words.
But I'm curious about just helping listeners understand the intolerable practices. It's very obvious around sexual harassment, that inappropriate touching or advances or things along those particular lines. So let's go through that. The second question would be around, is the office affair dead? Or
Sure,
okay.
yeah.
But let's go to the behaviours first and then move into the office affair.
Well, the behaviours, in terms of sexual harassment, the key element is whether or not it's conduct of a sexual nature, and there's a very broad definition of that, whether it has some sexual element to it, but also then whether the conduct is unwelcome. And so conduct that is welcome is not sexual harassment. Conduct that is reciprocated is not sexual harassment. If you're engaging in unwanted touching, unwanted propositions, unwanted sexual humour, sexual jokes, etc., that is sexual harassment.
Right.
That is sexual harassment. Provided, of course, the person who is subject to the behaviour genuinely takes offence to it.
Right.
You can't take offence on behalf of somebody else.
Right.
But if they're offended by it, it's unwelcome conduct, there was a reasonable basis for you thinking they could be offended by it or would be offended by it, then that's sexual harassment.
Just so to clarify, because human nature for millennia, I'm going to play a devil's advocate here,
Sure.
but human nature for millennia is, hey, I find you attractive, and I just happen to find you in the office, but I find you attractive. How am I going to signal that I find you attractive? Is that out of the question?
Not necessarily, and there's been a lot said about this that isn't quite right. So think about the notion of sexual harassment. One of the key elements is that it's unwelcome conduct.
Right.
So, but if the conduct is welcome, then it's not sexual harassment.
Okay, but I see often in Hollywood, say,
Yes.
or depictions of period films where, it's very inappropriate of Charles to actually make a move on me, and how dare he? But in
Yes.
actual fact, she's very interested. So that's the old style of romance, which was a little bit intriguing. Where's the intrigue nowadays? Just albeit that it's in the office.
Well, people have to be careful, Greg. There's no doubt about that.
Correct.
And so what you need to determine is whether or not your affections, this is in terms of office relationships.
This is not mine. I'm just making sure that my wife doesn't listen to this and get the wrong impression.
Greg, you need to assess whether or not the other person reciprocates those affections. That it can be tricky. That can be difficult. And so when it comes to workplace relationships, it's often the proposition is put that you can't ask someone out at work. From a legal perspective, I actually think it's very prudent not to ask anyone out at work. I think if you're going to ask someone out who you work with, you need to be pretty clear that there's going to be one of two responses, I think. Either that they're going to say, yes, I've been waiting for this all my life, or since I've met you, this is fantastic and wonderful, and then cue to the scenes of people running through fields of flowers, etc., and all of that
Tulips.
kind of thing. So that's all tulips and all of that. So that's great. Or alternatively, it's the thanks but no thanks. So, look, thank you very much. Appreciate your feelings, but to be honest with you, let's just be friends. And they're not offended by it, and they're able to just move on in a professional way, and it's sort of all forgotten. So either of those scenarios. What you don't want is a scenario where they then say, well, I don't know where this is coming from. I find this quite troubling or disturbing. I'm offended by it. And then they make a complaint about it. Because if they do make a complaint about it, I think it is going to be very difficult for someone who has asked a colleague out at work to argue that it's not, as a general proposition, to argue that it's not sexual harassment. So if you are going to ask someone out at work, you need to be pretty certain that they're going to either give you responses 1 or 2. Obviously, you want it to be 1, but you could probably live with 2 as opposed to the alternative of them making the complaint. You want to be pretty sure that they're going to give that sort of response.
Yeah.
And ideally, too, if you're going to ask someone out at work, get them perhaps away from the workplace in order to do that, to just a bit of separation from the workplace in order to do that. But this doesn't mean that the new paradigm, post-Me Too, doesn't mean that workplace relationships are dead or over or you can't date a colleague. That's not right. It just means that you need to navigate those issues a little bit more carefully. And that's been the case for many, many years.
Yeah.
And of course, you've also got to consider power imbalances, obligations to disclose those relationships. But there isn't a hard and fast rule against workplace relationships. Some employers purport to implement rules, no dating, no fraternising. They're almost certainly, in all cases, beyond the scope of a reasonable lawful direction that an employer can give. But nevertheless, you still need to be careful about sexual harassment. You can ask someone out at work, but they equally can say, well, I'm offended by that. I really find that troubling and disturbing, and I don't know where that came from, and I'm going off to HR. So you really need to be very, very sure about what that response is going to be.
And that'll come to training, policies, values, culture. And to that point, Michael, this is a very rich conversation, and there may be an opportunity for us to take it a little bit further down into a separate podcast.
Hope so.
But I found today particularly stimulating. And I don't mean that in the wrong way. I just had our sound engineer here just laughing. So please, out there in listener land, that wasn't meant to be anything other than intellectually stimulating. But the point is,
I took it that way, Greg. Don't worry.
Thank you. I didn't want to conflate that whatsoever. There are lots and lots of lessons that you've been able to help us with. The key point that we're making here is around the employee experience for employers, just to make sure that, one, there's an improved culture, there are overt values, there are policies in place, there's training in place, and probably to err more so on the side of caution than anything else. I want to thank Michael Burns, partner at Swab, for coming in, and I'm looking forward to having him into the studio another time. Thank you, Michael.
Thank you, Greg.
Thank you for listening to another podcast produced by Eagle Waves Radio. For more amazing podcasts, go to our website, eaglewavesradio.com.au. You can like us on Facebook and, of course, follow us on Twitter. Ever thought of having your own podcast? We can help.